Welcome to the WebMD Health Discovered podcast. I'm Dr. Neha Pathak, WebMD's Chief Physician Editor for Health and Lifestyle Medicine. In today's episode, we'll talk about seasonal allergies, from identifying triggers to managing symptoms. We'll look at why every allergy season feels worse than the year before. What's going on with regard to the pollen? How can we assess whether or not it's pollen that's actually causing our symptoms, possible treatment plans, and even some lesser known allergic reactions that happen because of pollen allergies? We'll also dig into the connection between climate change and the changing prevalence and potency of pollen allergens, and we'll learn valuable tips for combating seasonal allergies. First, let me introduce my guest, Dr. Stanley Feynman. Dr. Feynman has been in private allergy practice for over 40 years. He's current editor-in-chief for the publication Allergy Watch and serves on the editorial boards of the medical journals Annals of Allergy, Asthma, and Immunology and Allergy and Asthma Proceedings. Welcome to the WebMD Health Discovered podcast, Dr. Feynman.
Well, thanks, Dr. Pathak. I'm glad to be here.
So before we dig into, I think, a topic that has been affecting more and more people, particularly where we are in Atlanta, I'd love to talk about your own personal health discovery. What was your aha moment around changing patterns in seasonal allergies, if you've noticed any over your 40 years long career?
I think the aha moment in terms of pollen allergy was the fact that we noticed that patients seem to start having their symptoms earlier and earlier in the year. So when I started in practice, this was over 40 years ago, pollen in Atlanta really started to cause a lot of allergy symptoms for patients, usually in March. Late March is when it started getting warmer. And we were monitoring pollen counts, and we're noticing the pollen counts were increasing. So over the years, we've noticed that patients are complaining earlier and earlier that they're having their symptoms in the beginning of really during February even. And, so what happened, and you're talking about an aha moment, I guess my aha moment was the fact that when we did some research and analyzed when the pollen was really a problem, we realized that the pollen counts were starting earlier and in fact were higher. And so instead of telling patients to start their preventative allergy medicine around St. Patrick's Day in March, I've been telling patients to start it around Valentine's Day in February. And in fact, now I'm usually telling them to start it February 1st, just because that way it covers it a little bit earlier.
Before we dig into some of these changing patterns, can you help us understand what is actually going on in our bodies when we're having pollen allergies? What are some of the symptoms that you might expect if you're experiencing pollen allergies?
So patients who have pollen allergies really have an allergic predisposition. In other words, they are sensitized to have reactions that we call allergic type reactions to various proteins, and in this case, pollen. Patients can have allergic reactions to other kinds of proteins, dog dander, house dust mites, molds. Food is a very common one as well. And even insect sting, which is a problem around Atlanta and the Southeast, we see a lot of that. But in terms of pollen, what happens in the patients who have an allergic predisposition, they are exposed to the pollen. And what it does is it causes a reaction in their body by triggering a specific cell called a mast cell. The mast cell is a cell in the body that releases histamine when it is triggered. And it's triggered when you're allergic to a pollen, and it causes the release of the histamine and a variety of other chemical mediators, which are a little complex for us to go through over now. But the bottom line is because of this histamine release, it causes the symptoms. And the symptoms we usually see with pollen allergy include nasal congestion, sneezing, usually a series of sneezing, itching, and those are really the main types of symptoms that we see. Now, patients have other respiratory illness, such as asthma. It can cause lower airway symptoms as well, including the closing of their airways, wheezing, shortness of breath, coughing, and those are typically the symptoms that are triggered by allergies, especially pollens during pollen season.
That's really helpful. And so, one of the questions that I get a lot from patients is essentially if you're allergic to one type of pollen, say a particular type of tree pollen, does that make you more likely to also then be allergic to grass pollen, ragweed pollen? Do these travel together? Can you help us understand a little bit about the different vast array of pollen allergies? It's not necessarily just one thing.
So if a patient has an allergy to a tree pollen, then they are certainly predisposed to develop allergies to something else, typically other types of pollen. So we usually see people who have multiple pollen allergies. So in other words, they may have an allergy to a variety of trees. They usually have an allergy to grasses and frequently also may have trouble with ragweed. And the most common is probably dust mite and house dust mite. And also we see a lot of animal dander allergies. So the main thing is the patient who has a tree pollen allergy is predisposed to have other allergy triggers as well. And, this can be a real problem for patients. And the other thing that's interesting about allergies is it generally runs in families. So if your parents are allergic, then it's likely that the child is going to have an allergy as well.
So, are you noticing folks that didn't previously have allergies or weren't sensitized before? Are you noticing any propensity or new allergy sufferers in your office?
It's interesting that you say that because we clearly do see patients who start developing allergies even as an adult. Although the most common patient is as a pediatric patient who has allergies, and they're the ones who usually suffer the most. The specific IgE, the allergy antibody that's associated with allergies, usually peaks in school age and high school and college, and then it tends to wane or go down a little bit. So it's usually pediatric patients that we see and can treat, obviously very effectively for allergies. Adults, if they have a specific exposure to an allergy, and if they're predisposed to have allergies and then they get that specific exposure, they can cause symptoms. We see that a lot of times that, Atlanta tends to be a transient type community. In other words, we see a lot of people who move from other places, like you said you did from the New England. We see patients who move from other countries and they may never have been exposed to ragweed pollen or let's say some of the tree pollens that we have here or grass pollen. And it may take them a couple years of exposure before they start having symptoms, but then they do have symptoms. I would imagine that this podcast is that we have audience that are all around the country. And the classic example is the Southwest, where in places like Arizona, they didn't have that much trouble with allergies. And in fact, back in the 50s and 60s, people were told to move to Arizona because they're less likely to have a problem with the allergies there. But now what's happened is the residents have planted a lot of trees and plants that are called ornamentals. And we have that problem here too. They do have allergenic
Mm.
pollen and they can cause symptoms as well. So what I do recommend to patients is don't plan to move to another area if you think you're going to get away from a pollen allergy or an allergy, because quite likely you might develop the allergy at your new residence as well.
And can you talk a little bit about what role climate change is playing in the prevalence of allergies, the shifting patterns that you've noticed over your career?
I'm really glad you asked that. So today is Earth Day. So that's a very good topic to talk about. And we, in fact, have done some research at Atlanta Allergy where we measure pollen counts. And we published this a few years ago in the Annals of Allergy that showed that over a 27-year period, we did this in collaboration with the CDC, who have a vast database. And basically what we were able to show was that over 27 years, the pollen in Atlanta increased substantially. In fact, tree pollen increased 5% a year over that 27 years. And they were able to clearly correlate that to the warming of the temperature, the climate during those 27 years. This has been shown by other researchers as well. People have published this in a variety of ways and looking at this, and it's very, very well known. There was a big review article recently in one of our allergy journals looking at how global warming problem is worsening allergic disease. And it's not just really just pollen. What happens is, of course, the air pollution and some of the exhaust fumes from cars also increase people's reaction to pollen. So you might have an allergy to a pollen and it may cause that, maybe not that much trouble. But if you're then exposed to air pollution and exhaust fumes from cars, it can make your reaction a lot worse. One of the studies that I really enjoy referencing is the study that was done here in Atlanta during the 1996 Summer Olympic Games. And what we did in Atlanta was that during that time, and we loved having the Olympics here, and what they did is they closed the highways to traffic. And they had everybody take MARTA, which is our Metro Atlanta Rapid Transit. And so we were going downtown to visit the Olympics in rapid transit. Nobody drove. And over that 17 days of the Olympics, we found that there was a 40+% reduction in asthma visits in the pediatric emergency rooms here in Atlanta during that time. And it clearly correlated to the fall in exhaust fumes during that time. So we know from a variety of different studies that warming climate, exhaust fumes, air pollution all contribute and make allergy symptoms much, much worse for patients.
That's really helpful information. I love citing that Atlanta Olympic study as well, and have been really trying to dig into some of the pollution pollen connection. I think it's so interesting, as you say. It just almost is a double hit for us as humans. So our defense systems, when you're exposed to air pollution, are taking a hit. But I've been reading also recently that there's also pollution effects on plant life itself. So stress on the pollen itself that plants are creating, making their exine more fragile. So more likely to rupture and allow more allergens into the air per pollen grain. So that's been really something interesting that I've been looking into recently.
That has been reported. There was a very, very classic study specifically on ragweed, and they grew it under different concentrations of CO2, carbon dioxide. And they found that in the higher CO2, carbon dioxide environments, number one, there were more pollen grains of ragweed, but they were also more potent. In other words, they're more allergenic. So they had more allergenic pollen when the CO2 is higher. And that clearly correlates with air pollution and climate warming.
Well, so we've talked a little bit about the changing patterns of seasonal allergies and pollen allergies. We've talked about what's happening in our bodies, the types of symptoms. So I'd love it if we can spend the rest of our time together really in a step-by-step approach of managing the symptoms. So you mentioned one of the first things you do is start talking to patients earlier in the year about starting preventive therapy. So can you talk about some of that counseling that you provide to patients?
The main thing, I think, the first thing patients have to do is get an accurate diagnosis. I mean, allergy symptoms, usually, as we talked about, nasal congestion, sneezing, itchy eyes, a lot of times people who have viral illnesses can have similar symptoms. They don't have the itch, but they can have the nasal congestion and sometimes a cough and a sneezing. And that may not be due to allergy, may not be triggered by allergies. I mean, probably about 25 to 30% of the population have some kind of an allergy problem. And so everybody does not always have allergies or pollen triggering their symptoms. So the most important thing to do is get an accurate diagnosis. So it's a good idea to go to an allergist, get an allergy skin test, and identify what's causing it. Now, once you do identify what can trigger it, then if it's a pollen, you can monitor your pollen counts. They're published on a regular basis throughout the country. We're part of the National Allergy Bureau, which publishes the regional pollen counts. And so you can monitor it and see when it's the highest and when you probably need to stay indoors. We did a very interesting study in collaboration with Emory Public Health Group looking at a new device that is using automated intelligence to identify pollen. And the beauty of that is that they're able to then monitor the pollen throughout the day over a 24-hour period, whereas we usually do our pollen counts once a day that measure the previous 24 hours. So using this automated intelligence machine, we were able to show that the pollen count is usually lowest between 4 a.m. in the morning and noon, and then peaks between noon and the early evening when the temperature is the highest. So we've been advising patients to stay indoors and avoid the pollen in the early afternoon and throughout the late afternoon when the temperature is the highest. And it's not necessarily that important to stay indoors during the early morning hours, although in the past people thought that. But now we have data, and we published this. We presented this at the college allergy meeting about a year or so ago, and we're in the process of putting together a paper to be published as well. So it's clearly that advising patients when to avoid it is helpful. Using medications can be helpful if you have respiratory symptoms like the sneezing, the nasal congestion. Topical nasal steroids are probably the most effective. Antihistamines can help. We usually recommend the second generation or relatively non-sedating type antihistamines so that patients don't have a reduction in their cognitive abilities. And then, of course, the ultimate therapy is allergy immunotherapy. Allergy immunotherapy is a procedure where we administer a very, very small dose of the allergen to the patient and increase the dosage over a period of time. And their immune system is able to build a tolerance. So when they are exposed to the pollen again, they don't have the same trigger symptoms. It doesn't trigger the same symptoms.
I think that that's really helpful information. In terms of just the length of time of being on some of these medicines, as you mentioned, allergy seasons are starting earlier, they're longer. What's the science, what's the data around being on nasal steroids or antihistamines for prolonged periods of time?
So nasal steroids are very safe. The data shows that it does seem to have a healing effect on the immune and the pathologic disruption of the nasal membranes from the allergies. And so studies have been done using biopsies, looking at using the nasal steroids for over 5 years and no significant problem. We can use nasal steroids during pregnancy. It doesn't affect the baby. Antihistamines the same way, especially that's why we recommend the second generation non-sedating, but those are also frequently used in pregnancy and in very young children, and it doesn't disrupt their cognitive ability to learn, play, things like that.
And so when you say second generation, you're talking about things like loratadine, cetirizine. Is that the right category?
Correct.
I would love to kind of talk about the crossover potentially with seasonal allergies, pollen allergies, and oral allergy symptoms. So the oral allergy syndrome, are you seeing more of that? Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Oral allergy syndrome is basically a phenomena where patients who have a pollen allergy have untoward reactions to certain fresh fruits, such as apples, peaches, kiwi, can make their mouth itch. Usually doesn't cause anaphylaxis, but it's because of the pollen allergy. If these fruits are heated or cooked, it usually doesn't cause those symptoms.
And so if you have immunotherapy to treat your pollen allergy, does it also resolve the oral allergy syndrome? Or is that now then a separate pathway?
No, it frequently helps them. I mean, it absolutely. I've had patients on immunotherapy who've had itching in their mouth with apples because of oral allergy, and they come back and they say, boy, I can eat an apple now. That's amazing. And, it's an interesting phenomenon because their allergy skin test is strongly positive to tree pollen, but it's negative to apple. So it's not that they're allergic to the apple. They're allergic to a protein in the pressed apple that cross-reacts with the tree pollen. And once you either heat the apple to denature that protein or you treat the patients for the tree pollen allergy, then the patients are usually able to tolerate it.
What do you recommend with regard to finding the right HEPA filter or air filter for the home?
Air filters, can sometimes be helpful. There's been conflicting data in terms of how helpful they are. We just usually recommend patients they can be very expensive too. Usually there are other things such as avoidance measures that are much more effective than sometimes some of these filters that can be very costly and expensive. So I usually recommend patients to do the more practical things before they start spending a lot of money on fancy filters.
So I am so thankful to you for this conversation. I think this has really helped with actionable information, but I'd love to close the episode with just asking you for some more bite-sized action items, tips that someone listening today can take with them to help improve their allergy symptoms tomorrow.
Well, first of all, they should have an accurate diagnosis and understand what's triggering their symptoms, and in terms of other things, allergies can be cumulative. In other words, if somebody comes in and they're allergic to a tree pollen and they're also exposed to a dog and they're allergic to the dog, and they're exposed to house dust mite, and all those things together can really cause them to have more symptoms earlier. So patients who have allergies should be aware that animal allergy can be a problem, environmental allergens can be a problem. And the other thing that we need to really remember is smoke is a serious, serious problem and makes things a lot worse. They need to have no smoking and avoid it. And that's another message I think we should stress for patients.
Thank you so much for being with us today, Dr. Feynman. We've talked with Dr. Stanley Feynman about why it feels like pollen allergies are getting worse every year, other types of allergies that pollen allergies trigger, and the importance of diagnosis and early treatment interventions so that you can get the most out of enjoying the spring season and beyond. To find out more information about Dr. Feynman and his work, visit atlantaallergy.com. And we'll have more information about how to connect with him and his practice in our show notes. Thank you so much for listening. Please take a moment to follow, rate, and review this podcast on your favorite listening platform. If you'd like to send me an email about topics you're interested in or questions for future guests, please send me a note at webmdpodcast@webmd.net. This is Dr. Neha Pathak for the WebMD Health Discovered podcast.